People often say that blood is thicker than water, but in this house, blood is just a cheap liquid measured by greed and selfishness. I am Kaitlyn, 26 years old, an age where I've realized that human hearts can sometimes be colder and more brittle than stone. I stepped into our Charleston home amidst the sweltering heat, but it was the chilling indifference of my own family that made me shudder. My older sister stood there like a tyrant, screaming in the face of our mother, who was trembling from a heart condition, all because she refused to cancel her life-saving surgery scheduled for the next morning, just to babysit so my sister could attend a superficial fashion event. As my mother burst into tears, her eyes pleading for a shred of empathy, my sister merely let out a hollow, mocking laugh, delivering a lethal blow by claiming that mother no longer held any value to this family since she could no longer provide labor. A haunting silence filled the room as my father stood by, arms crossed in cold apathy, silently endorsing this cruelty simply because my sister was the successful one. Seeing my mother silently clutch her tightening chest, clinging to the last remnants of her dignity as she walked toward the door, I knew an era of submission had ended. We walked away, leaving behind those who view family as mere tools, but what they never suspected was that my mother holds the key to a secret will that my sister and father have craved for years. This departure was not a defeat, but the beginning of a reckoning that those selfish souls will pay for dearly. If you believe that no mother deserves to be treated like a disposable appliance, please subscribe to our channel and share your outrage in the comments below. For years, I buried my head in spreadsheets and financial risk assessments at the local investment firm, where I worked as a senior analyst, hoping that my professional success would eventually earn me a shred of respect within the walls of our family home. My daily routine involved managing multi-million-dollar portfolios for strangers, yet I returned every evening to a household where my hard-earned salary was treated like a communal fountain for everyone except myself. Dad sat at the head of the dinner table with a heavy silence that demanded submission, waiting for the moment I would hand over the monthly envelope containing nearly half of my paycheck, under the guise of repaying a debt for my upbringing that apparently never ended. While I meticulously tracked every cent to ensure our mortgage was covered and the property taxes were paid, Miranda would sweep into the room with an air of unearned royalty, dropping her toddlers onto Mom's lap without a second thought for our mother's fragile health. Miranda loved to flaunt her supposed status as a successful boutique owner, often leaning across the table to remind me that I was nothing more than a glorified paper pusher who lacked the vision to build a real empire. I found myself paying for the premium shingles on our roof and the expensive copper piping in the basement, yet a secret review of the house deed revealed that my name was nowhere to be found on the legal title of the very property I was keeping afloat. The unfairness of our living situation reached a boiling point one humid evening when Dad pushed a glossy automotive brochure toward me while Miranda sipped her wine with a predatory smile on her face. He cleared his throat and told me with absolute conviction that it was time for me to finance a luxury SUV for Miranda because her current vehicle was too outdated to represent the prestige of the Miller family name. I stared at the luxury price tag on the paper, realizing that the monthly payment alone would wipe out my remaining emergency savings, but Dad merely shrugged and said that my contributions were the least I could do for the sister who provided the family with grandchildren. Miranda then leaned forward with a look of feigned concern, suggesting that I should surrender control of my personal savings account to her so she could invest it into her boutique expansion for my own benefit. She claimed that my cautious financial nature was holding me back from true wealth, even though I knew her business was bleeding money, and she only wanted my capital to fund her extravagant lifestyle. Mom watched the entire exchange with a hollow expression, her eyes darting between us as she remained painfully silent while her husband and eldest daughter systematically stripped away my financial autonomy. Every time I tried to mention the rising costs of mom's medication or the fact that I was already working 60 hours a week, Miranda would cut me off by insisting that her time was more valuable because she was building a legacy for the future generation. Dad always nodded in agreement with her, reinforcing the idea that my only purpose was to serve as a silent bank for the people who actually mattered in his eyes. I spent many nights sitting in my small bedroom surrounded by tax documents and bank statements that proved I was the only person keeping this family from financial ruin, yet I was treated like a tenant who was lucky to have a place to sleep. The irony of being a financial expert who was being financially abused by her own kin was a weight that grew heavier with every passing day, as I realized that my loyalty was being weaponized against me. Miranda's children would cry in the next room while Mom struggled to keep up with their demands, but Dad would simply turn up the television volume to drown out the reality of the chaos he helped create. I realized that my role as the responsible daughter was actually a prison sentence that I had unknowingly signed by being too willing to help when things first started to go wrong. The silence during our family meals became a weapon that Dad used to exert his dominance, making it clear that any dissent from me would be met with an immediate lecture on the importance of family unity and sacrifice. Miranda continued to purchase designer clothes and expensive jewelry using credit cards that I suspected were somehow linked to the household accounts I was strictly forbidden from auditing without Dad's explicit permission. I watched Mom's hands shake as she cleared the plates, knowing that she was terrified of the tension, but too broken by years of Geoffrey's control to stand up for the daughter who was actually protecting her. It was becoming increasingly clear that my sister viewed my professional expertise as a threat to her manipulation, which only made her more aggressive in her attempts to diminish my self-worth in front of our parents. The red brick house that I had worked so hard to maintain started to feel like a fortress built on lies, where the people inside were more dangerous than any stranger I encountered in the corporate world. My heart ached for the woman Mom used to be before she became a shadow of herself, trapped between a husband who demanded obedience and a daughter who demanded everything else. As the weeks turned into months, the demands for the new vehicle and the access to my savings became a daily ritual of harassment that made the simple act of coming home feel like walking into a trap. Miranda would leave her unpaid bills on my dresser with little sticky notes, asking me to take care of them as a favor, yet she never missed an opportunity to tell me how much more successful she was than I could ever hope to be. Dad would remind me at every turn that he had sacrificed his youth to provide for me, using a twisted sense of guilt to ensure that I never questioned the thousands of dollars disappearing from our joint household fund. I started to notice small discrepancies in our utility bills and property records that suggested Dad was siphoning off even more money than he was admitting to, likely to cover Miranda's mounting business debts. The realization that my own father was actively sabotaging my financial future to save a daughter who wouldn't even pay for her own mother's doctor visits was the final straw that began to break my resolve to stay. 3 weeks after the day I finally helped Mom escape the suffocating atmosphere of the Miller household, I found myself sitting in the dimly lit records room of the county clerk office. The sterile smell of old paper and digital printers surrounded me as I waited for the official property history of my grandmother's estate to appear on the flickering computer screen. I had spent years assuming that the valuable coastal land Mom inherited was safely tucked away in a trust for her future care, but my professional intuition as a financial analyst told me that something had gone terribly wrong during my final months in Charleston. As the PDF file finally loaded, my blood ran cold when I saw the recorded deed transfer indicating that the $100,000 plot of land had been signed over to Miranda just 2 months prior. The document bore Mom's signature, yet the shaky and irregular handwriting was a blatant forgery that any observant person would have questioned immediately. What made my heart sink even further was seeing Dad's name listed as the legal witness and authorizing guardian, effectively handing over our mother's only financial safety net to his favorite daughter. It became painfully clear that Dad had used his position of trust to help Miranda liquidate Mom's assets just to save her failing fashion boutique from an embarrassing public bankruptcy. I sat there in the quiet office feeling a mixture of profound grief and white-hot rage as I realized my own father had knowingly participated in a criminal act against his vulnerable wife. While I was struggling to pay for groceries and utilities, my sister was using stolen equity to maintain her image of a successful socialite among the Charleston elite. I spent the rest of the afternoon digging through digital archives and discovered that Miranda had even managed to change the mailing address on several major bank accounts. A long list of past due notices and credit card statements had been rerouted to a private apartment that Miranda kept as a secret studio away from her husband and children. These were debts I was supposed to be paying, yet I had never even seen the bills, because my sister had systematically hijacked my entire financial identity. Just as I was leaving the government building, my phone vibrated with an incoming text message from Miranda that sent a fresh wave of nausea through my stomach. She didn't ask about Mom's recovery or offer an apology, but instead sent a mocking photo of herself enjoying a luxury spa day, with a caption telling me that no matter where I hid, I would always be the one working to fund her inevitable success. She reminded me that since my name was attached to the business loans she had secured, I would be the one facing the creditors if I ever stopped sending her the money she felt entitled to receive. I stared at the screen for a long time, realizing that my sister truly believed she was untouchable because she had Dad protecting her every move within our fractured family. Instead of spiraling into despair, I walked across the street to a quiet corner cafe and made the most important phone call of my life to a private investigator named Detective Vance. I had heard about his reputation for uncovering complex corporate fraud and elder financial abuse cases through my contacts at the investment firm where I worked. When we finally met in his small, cluttered office, I introduced Detective Vance to the mountain of suspicious documents I had gathered, explaining that he was the only person who could help me secure the evidence needed for a legal reckoning. He listened with a grim expression as I detailed how Miranda and Dad had collaborated to strip Mom of her dignity and her inheritance, while burying me under a mountain of fraudulent debt. Vance didn't offer empty platitudes or emotional comfort, which I appreciated, because I needed a strategist who could navigate the murky waters of South Carolina property law. He told me that if we could prove the signatures were forged, and that the address changes were made without my consent, we could build a federal case that would bring Miranda's empire crumbling down. I handed over a folder containing Mom's actual medical records from the week the deed was signed, showing she was heavily medicated and physically incapable of attending a notary appointment. Vance nodded slowly, noting that the timing of the transfer was suspiciously close to the date Miranda had made a large deposit into her struggling business account. It was the first time in weeks that I felt a glimmer of hope, knowing that I finally had a professional ally who wasn't blinded by the toxic loyalty that had ruined my family. We spent the next 2 hours mapping out a plan to track the digital footprint of the address changes and identify the notary who had recklessly stamped the forged documents. I knew that by involving an investigator like Vance, I was crossing a point of no return that would likely end with my father and sister behind bars, but the memory of Mom sitting broken in that kitchen gave me the strength to proceed. As I walked back to the small apartment where Mom was resting, I felt a strange sense of calm, knowing that the shadows I had been living in were finally starting to lift. I didn't tell Mom about the land or the detective yet, because her heart was still too fragile to handle the weight of such a massive betrayal from her own husband. Instead, I focused on the meticulous details of the investigation, ensuring that every financial transaction and forged signature was documented with clinical precision for the upcoming battle. Miranda thought she was playing a game of social status and influence, but she failed to realize that she was dealing with someone who understood the power of a paper trail better than she ever would. The Charleston sun was setting over the harbor, casting long shadows across the cobblestone streets. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of what was hiding in the dark. I was Kaitlyn Miller, a woman who had spent her career protecting the assets of strangers, and I was finally ready to use those skills to destroy the people who had tried to steal my soul. The clock on the sterile hospital wall struck exactly 10 on Tuesday morning as I watched the medical team wheel Mom into the operating theater for her long-awaited heart surgery. I sat in the desolate waiting room clutching a lukewarm cup of coffee, feeling a profound sense of isolation because neither Dad nor Miranda had sent a single message to check on her condition. The rhythmic beeping of nearby monitors and the hushed whispers of nurses were the only sounds filling the corridors until the heavy double doors swung open with a violent force. I looked up to see Miranda and Dad marching toward me with expressions that held no trace of concern for the woman currently fighting for her life under the surgeon's knife. Miranda was holding a thick manila envelope and began pacing back and forth, complaining about how much time she was wasting by being at the hospital during her busiest business week. Dad stood beside her with his arms crossed, his eyes cold and distant, as he demanded to know exactly how much longer the procedure would take so they could speak with Mom the moment she woke up. Their true intentions became sickeningly clear 2 hours later when Mom was moved into the recovery unit, still groggy and fragile from the heavy anesthesia. Instead of offering comfort or holding her hand, Miranda leaned over the hospital bed and began shaking Mom's shoulder to force her into a state of semi-consciousness. She pulled a set of legal documents from her envelope, which I immediately recognized as a power of attorney and a full withdrawal authorization for Mom's remaining retirement funds. Miranda whispered urgently into Mom's ear that the boutique was facing a foreclosure notice and that only this money could prevent the family from social ruin in the Charleston community. I watched in absolute horror as Miranda reached out to adjust the heart rate monitor cables, trying to prop Mom up against the pillows so she could sign the papers with a trembling hand. Dad stood at the foot of the bed, acting as a lookout, his face an impenetrable mask of apathy as he ignored the clear signs of Mom's physical distress. A wave of protective fury surged through my veins as I stepped between my sister and the bed, snatching the fraudulent documents out of her hands before she could force the pen into Mom's weak grip. I raised my voice to call for the attending nurses and declared that I was the primary medical proxy, which gave me the legal authority to remove anyone interfering with the patient's recovery. Miranda's face contorted with a mixture of rage and desperation as she screamed that I was an ungrateful child who was sabotaging her only chance at financial survival. The head nurse hurried into the room and assessed the situation, noticing the fluctuating readings on the monitor caused by the intense stress my family was inflicting on our mother. I stood my ground and demanded that security escort both Dad and Miranda out of the wing, immediately making it clear that their presence was no longer welcome in this hospital. Dad tried to assert his dominance by claiming he was the head of the household, but the clinical staff ignored his bluster and firmly guided them toward the exit. Once the room was finally quiet again, I sat by Mom's side and felt a heavy weight of grief for the family bond that had been irrevocably shattered by their bottomless greed. My phone vibrated with a priority alert from Detective Vance, so I stepped into the hallway to read the encrypted file he had just forwarded to my personal email. The information contained in that message was far more sinister than anything I had previously imagined regarding my sister's long-term schemes. Vance had uncovered a private life insurance policy that Miranda had taken out on Mom several months ago, featuring an astronomical payout and a double indemnity clause for accidental death. Miranda had listed herself as the sole irrevocable beneficiary, effectively placing a massive bounty on the life of the woman who was currently struggling to breathe in the next room. I realized with a sickening jolt that they weren't just waiting for Mom's money, but they were actually hoping her heart would fail during this surgery so they could claim the ultimate prize. The realization that my own flesh and blood viewed our mother's existence as nothing more than a profitable casualty changed something fundamental deep inside my soul. I stared at the digital documents provided by Vance, noting that the premium payments for this secret policy were being funded by the very bank accounts Miranda had stolen from me. They were using my hard-earned salary to bet on our mother's demise, creating a twisted cycle of betrayal that made my previous anger feel insignificant. I returned to Mom's bedside and vowed that I would never let either of them get close to her again, regardless of the legal or social consequences I might face. The betrayal was no longer just about forged signatures or stolen land, but it had escalated into a calculated gamble with a human life that I was determined to win. I spent the rest of the night monitoring Mom's vitals and coordinating with Vance to ensure that every piece of evidence was preserved for the authorities. The monsters I called a father and sister had finally revealed their true faces under the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital, and I was ready to ensure they never saw the sun as free citizens again. 2 weeks after Mom was finally discharged from the hospital, the true scale of the financial devastation orchestrated by my own family began to emerge from the shadows. I met with Detective Vance in a quiet corner of the city park where he handed over a thick dossier containing the records of 5 different high-limit credit cards that had been opened in my name without my knowledge. My heart hammered against my ribs as I saw the total outstanding balance had climbed to an astronomical $200,000, all of which had been funneled into Miranda's failing boutique and her obsession with luxury designer handbags. It was sickening to realize that while I was meticulously saving every penny for a stable future, my sister was treating my credit score like a limitless inheritance to fund her delusions of grandeur. The investigation further revealed that Dad had played a crucial role in this betrayal by using his military pension credentials to help Miranda forge my employment records and salary slips. Together, they had secured a massive secondary mortgage on our childhood home by claiming that the funds were needed for Mom's medical care, even though every cent was diverted into Miranda's plummeting business accounts. My best friend Chloe, who had always suspected Miranda's business was a front for something more sinister, decided it was time to take matters into her own hands to support my legal battle. Chloe spent several afternoons posing as a high-end client at the boutique using a hidden camera to record the suspicious cash transactions and the blatant tax evasion occurring behind the ornate sales counter. These recordings provided the concrete evidence we needed to prove that Miranda was intentionally underreporting her revenue to the federal authorities while simultaneously draining my personal accounts to keep the doors open. One evening, my phone rang with a call from Miranda that was filled with such intense vitriol it made my hands tremble as I pressed the device to my ear. She didn't bother with pleasantries, but instead hissed that if I didn't continue making the minimum monthly payments on those secret loans, she would contact my employer and claim I had committed professional malpractice. Miranda truly believed that her threat to ruin my career would force me back into submission, but she had no idea that I was already steps ahead of her in a game she was destined to lose. The most heartbreaking moment occurred later that night, when I decided to show Mom the undeniable evidence of the people she had spent 40 years trying to protect. I sat beside her on the sofa and opened a digital folder on my tablet, displaying the high-resolution photographs Chloe had captured of Miranda laughing and drinking expensive champagne at a gala on the very night Mom was undergoing open-heart surgery. Mom stared at the images for a long time, her eyes filling with a mixture of profound sorrow and a sudden sharp clarity that I had never seen before. She looked at the timestamp on the photos, and then at her own surgical scars, finally realizing that her eldest daughter had viewed her potential death as nothing more than a social inconvenience. The silence in the room was heavy, as Mom began to understand that Dad had not only allowed this to happen, but had actively assisted in the systematic theft of our family's security. She didn't cry this time, but instead she took my hand and told me with a firm voice that she was ready to cooperate with whatever legal actions were necessary to stop the madness. Detective Vance called me shortly after to confirm that the financial trail led directly back to a shell company Miranda had established, using Dad's old business license as a shield. It was a sophisticated web of deceit that relied on my silence and my misplaced sense of duty to keep the entire structure from collapsing under its own weight. I spent the rest of the night organizing the tax documents and the recorded evidence Chloe had provided, ensuring that every detail was perfectly aligned for the federal investigators who were now monitoring the case. The realization that my sister was willing to sacrifice my entire career just to buy more time for her failing vanity project was the final confirmation I needed to move forward without any lingering guilt. I watched Mom sleep peacefully for the first time in months, knowing that the woman who had been a victim for so long was finally finding the strength to fight back against her oppressors. We were no longer just running away from the toxic influence of the Miller household, but we were actively dismantling the machinery of their greed from the outside. The morning sun began to rise over the horizon, casting a golden light across the piles of legal documents that now covered my dining table, like a battlefield map. I felt a strange sense of empowerment knowing that the secrets Miranda and Dad had kept for so long were finally being dragged into the unforgiving light of day. Chloe sent me a supportive message reminding me that I was not just protecting my own future, but also ensuring that Mom would never have to live in fear of being disposable again. Every transaction and forged signature I cataloged was a nail in the coffin of the life Miranda had built on a foundation of lies and stolen dreams. The weight of the $200,000 debt still hung over me, but it felt manageable now that I had the evidence to prove I was the victim of a sophisticated identity theft scheme. I was no longer the quiet analyst who followed orders, but a woman who was systematically reclaiming her life from the people who had tried to bury her in their own failures. The reckoning was coming for Miranda and Geoffrey, and for the first time in my life, I was the one who held all the power in our fractured family dynamic. The oppressive humidity of a late August afternoon hung heavily over the city as I sat in a secluded corner booth of a quiet Charleston cafe, waiting for the final confrontation that would decide the fate of my family. I had sent a formal invitation to Dad claiming that we needed to discuss a private settlement regarding the outstanding debts and Mom's future living arrangements. He arrived looking disheveled, but still maintained that arrogant posture of a man who believed his authority was absolute and unquestionable. I pushed a single sheet of paper across the table which served as a final ultimatum, demanding that he and Miranda surrender to the authorities for their financial crimes. Dad didn't even bother to read the document before he slammed his fist onto the wooden surface, causing several nearby patrons to turn their heads in sudden alarm. He began shouting that I was an ungrateful and disloyal daughter who was intentionally trying to destroy the brilliant fashion career Miranda had worked so hard to build. Before I could respond to his outburst, Miranda herself swept into the cafe wearing an expensive silk dress and a pair of designer sunglasses that probably cost more than Mom's monthly medication. She sat down beside Dad with a smug expression, leaning forward to inform me that I had absolutely no legal standing because every document had been properly notarized and validated by her husband's influential business associates. Miranda laughed at my suggestion of a confession, claiming that I was merely a jealous sibling who couldn't handle the fact that she was the chosen star of the Miller legacy. I remained perfectly calm as I pulled out my tablet and pressed play on a video file that Detective Vance had meticulously recovered from a deleted cloud server. The footage showed Miranda in her private studio clearly admitting that Mom had outlived her usefulness and discussing the potential payout from the secret life insurance policy she had secured. The sound of her own voice discussing our mother's death like a business transaction echoed through the small cafe, stripping away the polished mask of the successful entrepreneur she pretended to be. Miranda's face shifted from a look of triumph to a ghostly, sickly pallor as she realized that her most private and dark ambitions were now laid bare for the world to see. I signaled toward the front entrance, and two uniformed investigators from the Charleston Police Department stepped out from behind a decorative curtain to witness the aftermath of my revelation. These officers had been listening to the entire conversation through a concealed microphone that Vance had provided to ensure every threat was recorded for the upcoming trial. Miranda tried to stand up and flee, but her legs seemed to fail her as the reality of a lengthy prison sentence finally began to sink into her mind. Dad jumped to his feet and tried to use his booming voice to intimidate the officers, claiming that this was a private family matter that didn't require the interference of the state. He turned his rage toward me, pointing a trembling finger and demanding that I tell the police that everything was just a misunderstanding and that family always comes first. I stood up slowly and looked directly into his eyes, seeing for the first time that the man I had spent my life trying to please was nothing more than a hollow shell of greed. I told him with absolute conviction that the family he was trying to protect had died the moment he helped Miranda forge Mom's signature on that property deed. The investigators moved forward to read Miranda her rights, their clinical tone contrasting sharply with the desperate sobs that were now escaping from her throat. Dad continued to plead with me to save his reputation, offering to return a fraction of the stolen money if I would only make the evidence disappear before it reached the district attorney. I realized that even at this final stage he was still trying to negotiate the price of his soul, while showing no remorse for the pain he had inflicted on his wife and younger daughter. I turned my back on both of them, walking toward the exit while the sounds of clicking handcuffs provided the only closure I truly needed after years of silent suffering. The investigators led them away through the back door to avoid a public scene, but the damage to the Miller name was already permanent and irreversible. I stepped out into the cooling evening air, feeling a profound sense of relief that the cycle of manipulation and theft had finally been broken by the truth. The cafe was quiet again, yet I could still hear the echoes of Dad's desperate cries for loyalty that he had never actually earned through his own actions. I took a deep breath and realized that for the first time in 26 years, I was no longer defined by the expectations or the crimes of the people who shared my blood. I sent a short message to Mom to let her know that the nightmare was over and that we could finally begin to rebuild our lives without the constant threat of betrayal. The road ahead would be difficult as we navigated the legal fallout, but the weight that had been crushing my chest for months was finally gone. I walked down the cobblestone street toward my car, leaving the broken pieces of my former life on that cafe table where they belonged. I was no longer a victim of my family's greed, but the architect of their downfall, and the protector of the only person who truly loved me. Only 4 days after that final meeting at the cafe, the sharp wail of police sirens shattered the quiet afternoon air in front of Miranda's glamorous fashion boutique in the heart of downtown Charleston. I stood on the opposite sidewalk watching through the large display windows as several officers entered the store, just as a group of elite customers were browsing the latest spring collection. The sophisticated atmosphere of the shop vanished instantly as the lead investigator presented an arrest warrant for identity theft, federal tax fraud, and organized elderly abuse. Miranda was forced to drop a silk scarf she was holding as the handcuffs clicked loudly around her manicured wrists, in full view of the wealthy socialites she had worked so hard to impress. Her face was a mask of pure terror as she was led toward the exit, her expensive heels clicking frantically against the marble floor that had been paid for with stolen money. At the same time, another squad car pulled up to our family home to take Dad into custody for his role as a co-conspirator in forging legal documents and concealing the massive debts hidden under my name. The fall of the Miller family was swift and merciless, as bank officials arrived shortly after to place official seizure notices on the doors of the boutique and our childhood red brick house. Every piece of furniture and every designer garment was officially inventoried for public auction to recover the staggering financial losses that Miranda's greed had inflicted upon the community. As Miranda was being guided toward the waiting patrol car, she spotted me standing in the distance and began screaming my name with a desperation that chilled me to the bone. She shrieked that I was a heartless monster who had intentionally destroyed the bright future of her two young children by refusing to keep her secrets any longer. Her accusations echoed down the street, but I noticed that even the passers-by looked away in disgust as they realized the extent of the betrayal she had committed against her own flesh and blood. Dad sat in the back of the second police vehicle with his head bowed, finally stripped of the arrogant authority he had used to manipulate Mom and me for so many years. By the following morning, the local newspapers were filled with detailed reports exposing the truth behind Miranda's supposedly successful fashion empire and her secret lifestyle. The articles revealed a complex web of high-interest loans from predatory lenders and a long history of business losses that she had hidden through creative accounting and identity fraud. Everyone in Charleston now knew that the Miller family reputation was a hollow shell built on a foundation of lies, stolen equity, and the systemic exploitation of a vulnerable elderly woman. The public record now showed that Miranda had been using my credit identity to secure luxury vehicles and international vacations, while Mom was struggling to afford the basic costs of her heart medication. Seeing the evidence printed in black and white was a surreal experience that finally confirmed the magnitude of the darkness I had been fighting against for the past decade. I spent the afternoon helping Mom navigate the legal paperwork required to protect her remaining assets from the inevitable wave of creditors that would soon descend upon the estate. Mom sat in our small temporary apartment, her eyes fixed on a news segment detailing the charges against her husband and eldest daughter, yet she remained remarkably composed despite the public scandal. She told me that the loss of the big house and the family name felt like a small price to pay for the peace of mind she finally enjoyed in our new honest life. We watched as a team of movers began hauling out the expensive display cases from the boutique, realizing that the glamorous world Miranda had manufactured was disappearing as quickly as a summer storm. The investigators contacted me to confirm that they had recovered the original forged documents from a hidden safe in Dad's home office, providing the final piece of evidence needed for a conviction. Every secret they had kept, and every lie they had told, was now being cataloged by the justice system as a permanent record of their moral bankruptcy. I felt a strange sense of closure as I realized that the people who had treated me as a disposable appliance were now facing the consequences of their own choices. The social circles that had once praised Miranda's business acumen were now quick to distance themselves from the disgrace, leaving her with no allies and no resources to fight the legal battle ahead. Dad's military pension was now subject to legal scrutiny, and the house I had spent so much money maintaining was now nothing more than an asset on a bank's balance sheet. I felt no joy in their suffering, but I did feel a profound sense of justice for the woman who was currently resting comfortably in the next room without fear of being shouted at or ignored. The fall of the Miller Empire served as a stark reminder that a legacy built on the suffering of others is destined to crumble under the weight of its own deception. I took a final look at the news reports before closing my laptop, ready to focus on the long process of rebuilding my own credit and my mother's broken spirit. We were finally free from the invisible chains of debt and duty that had defined our existence for far too long. The street outside was quiet now, the sirens having faded into the distance as the city moved on from the scandal that had rocked our family to its core. I realized that while Miranda and Dad were beginning their new lives behind bars, Mom and I were beginning ours in the warm light of the truth. There would be no more forged signatures, no more secret loans, and no more screams of unworthiness echoing through a house made of stolen bricks. I reached out to Chloe to thank her for the recordings that had helped secure this victory, knowing that I would never have survived this ordeal without the support of a true friend. My career as a financial analyst was still intact, and I knew that my professional skills would now be used to protect people like my mother from predators like my sister. The future was an open book, and for the first time in my life, I was the only person holding the pen. 5 years have passed since the echoes of the gavel finally silenced the chaos that had consumed my life for so long. The legal proceedings were grueling and emotionally draining, yet they resulted in a definitive victory for the truth that I had fought so hard to uncover. Miranda received a 7-year prison sentence without the possibility of parole due to the sophisticated nature of her identity theft and the calculated exploitation of our mother's health. I heard from a former family acquaintance that she spends her days in a state facility stripped of the designer labels and the social status that she once valued more than her own family. Dad was not sentenced to prison because of his age and deteriorating health, but he was forced into a life of isolation that felt like a far more severe punishment for a man of his pride. He now resides in a cramped government-subsidized apartment on the outskirts of the city, completely abandoned by the social circles that once fueled his arrogance. None of his old military friends or business associates returned his calls after the details of his betrayal were made public in the local newspapers. Mom and I decided to leave the painful memories of Charleston behind us and relocated to a small, sun-drenched cottage on the northern coast. It is a quiet place, where the only sounds are the rhythmic crashing of the waves and the gentle rustle of the sea oats in the wind. Mom has experienced a miraculous recovery that the doctors initially thought was impossible, given the severity of her heart condition and the years of psychological trauma she endured. Without the constant pressure of Dad's disapproval and Miranda's demands, her spirit has flourished in a way that brings a sense of warmth to our new home every single day. I spent nearly 3 years engaged in a relentless legal battle with the credit bureaus and financial institutions to erase the fraudulent debts that had been attached to my name. It was a tiring process that required mountains of evidence and constant communication with investigators, but I finally succeeded in restoring my personal credit score to its former glory. I am no longer looking over my shoulder for creditors or worrying about a sister who viewed my hard work as her own personal bank account. One peaceful Sunday afternoon, I sat on the wooden porch of our cottage and watched Mom as she meticulously tended to her new garden of hydrangeas and lavender. Her movements were steady and graceful, reflecting a level of physical and emotional strength that I hadn't seen in her since I was a small child. I realized in that quiet moment that the traditional definition of family is often a hollow concept when it is not backed by unconditional love and mutual respect. Blood relations do not grant anyone the right to steal your future or treat your dignity as something to be traded for a luxury handbag or social prestige. My true family consisted of Mom and the few loyal friends like Chloe, who had risked everything to help me tear down a legacy of lies. The salt air felt clean against my skin as I reflected on the difficult journey we had traveled to reach this state of absolute freedom and financial independence. We are no longer victims of the Miller name, but survivors who have built a solid foundation on the ruins of a toxic and broken empire. I walked back inside the cottage and found an old cardboard box that I had kept hidden in the back of my closet since the day we left our old house. Inside was a framed family photograph from a decade ago, showing Dad, Miranda, and me standing together at a local country club event. We were all smiling for the camera, yet I could now see the cracks in the facade and the coldness in Miranda's eyes even back then. I took the photograph out to the small stone fire pit in the backyard where the embers from our morning fire were still glowing softly. I watched with a sense of profound liberation as the flames began to lick the edges of the glossy paper, slowly consuming the images of the people who had tried to destroy me. The past was literally turning into ash, and with it, the last remnants of the guilt and the anger that had weighed me down for so many years. I felt a strange sense of gratitude for the struggle because it had forced me to discover a strength within myself that I never knew existed. The sun began to set over the Atlantic Ocean, painting the sky in vibrant shades of orange and purple that seemed to signal the start of a new chapter in our lives. I returned to the porch and sat down beside Mom, who reached out to squeeze my hand with a firm and reassuring grip. We didn't need to speak because we both understood that the nightmare was finally over and that we were finally the masters of our own destinies. My career was thriving once again, and I was using my financial expertise to volunteer at a local center for victims of elder abuse and identity fraud. Helping others navigate the same dark waters that I had once drowned in gave my life a sense of purpose that the Miller family could never have understood. The cottage was filled with the smell of home-cooked food and the sound of Mom's favorite music playing softly in the background. It was a simple life far removed from the high-stakes drama of Charleston society, and it was exactly what we both needed to heal. I looked up at the first few stars appearing in the evening sky and felt a wave of peace wash over me as I thought about the road ahead. There would be no more lies, no more forged signatures, and no more predatory insurance policies looming over our heads like a death sentence. We had survived the wreckage of a broken family and emerged into a world that was brighter and more honest than anything we had ever known before. I was Kaitlyn Miller, a woman who had fought for her mother's life and her own freedom, and I had finally won the only battle that truly mattered. The ashes in the fire pit were cold now, and as I walked back inside to join my mother for dinner, I knew that the future belonged entirely to us. This was not just an ending to a long and painful story, but the beautiful beginning of a life lived on our own terms without fear and without regret.